Hi guys, and welcome to the fourth installment of this video series. In this video today, we're going to be discussing training. Okay, so the complete protocol that I followed throughout my contest prep. So in discussing training, we're pretty much discussing the science that goes behind creating an on-stage or stage-ready physique. So we're going to discuss it all in this episode. Periodization for weight training, and we're also going to discuss the cardio that I implemented throughout my prep. Okay guys, before we get into the periodization and the programming I followed throughout my prep, I'm going to give a very basic rundown of what a week's training sort of looked like. So throughout my prep, training days, the frequency was about 5 per week. So I was always in the gym lifting weights around 5 times per week. Okay, so this was all set out and prescribed, and we're going to talk about that prescription later. But the general gist is I was following, I guess you could say it was almost like a powerlifting model, but it would have sort of day 1 lower body specific, day 2 upper body specific, day 3 off, day 4 push, day 4 pull, and day 5 another lower body day. Okay, so as you can see, and as we're going to discuss later, my frequency was fairly high, and I was hitting isolating body parts at least 2 times per week. Okay, so this is said to be optimal, and I wasn't following a quote-unquote bro split and just doing chest one day, arms the other day. I was actually ensuring and accounting for volume and making sure I was getting in adequate amounts of training stimulus throughout specific training blocks. Okay, so before we jump in, let's go through some definitions first, because it's important to educate ourselves and know exactly what we have control over when designing a training program. So the first thing we want to discuss is volume and intensity. Well, the first thing we want to define is volume and intensity. So volume is simply sets multiplied by reps multiplied by weight within a session. Okay? Intensity is the percentage of 1 rep max or 1 RM utilized throughout the training session. Okay? So volume and intensity have an inverse relationship. That means that when volume is high throughout a training block, intensity will tend to be lower. And on the contrary, when intensity is high, volume will be on the lower end of the spectrum. Okay? So volume in layman's terms is the amount of sheer work you're doing. Okay? So a high volume session, for example, would be 5 sets of 10. Okay? So 50 reps total multiplied by the weight that you're completing. Okay? So in essence, or in theory, that means you're going to be using lower loads. Okay? So a lower percentage of 1 RM. Higher intensity training will involve less sets, less reps, and the utilization of higher loads. So that's a very rudimentary and basic definition of volume and intensity, but it's very important to keep in mind, and we're going to discuss that later. Okay, so now that we've defined volume and intensity, we want to define periodization. Okay, so there are many forms of periodization, but periodization in and of itself is the trend that a training program undergoes. So it's the manipulation of the acute variables, reps, sets, and weight utilized over time. So linear periodization refers to the gradual adjustment or increase or decrease in volume/intensity over time. Okay, so if we're talking about volume, for example, a linear program, if we want to increase volume over time, will show increases in the reps slash sets slash weight throughout weeks within a training block. Okay, so say week 1 you do 5 sets of 10 on squat with 130 kilograms, and week 2 you do 5 sets of 11 with 130 kilograms. Okay, that's a linear progression. So linear periodization tends to be across a mesocycle or a series of weeks within a training block. Okay, so let's define DUP, or daily undulating periodization. So DUP is that same variance in acute variables, but over a microcycle, so a week of training. So in layman's terms, it's just the variation in work completed within a week. So say week 1, day 1, you squat, okay, and that particular squat session is 4 sets of 10 reps. Through undulating, or an undulation pattern, would be week 1, day 3, say you have another squat session, instead of doing 4 sets of 10, you vary the rep ranges or sets completed to 5 sets of 6. Okay, so that's an undulating pattern, and that is also, as we'll discuss later, is also very, very important to consider when constructing this program. The next thing we want to consider is auto-regulation. Now, in defining auto-regulation, in terms of weight training and bodybuilding, we want to use the RPE scale. Okay, so this is a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being minimal effort and 10 being maximal effort. Okay, and we use this to prescribe load, just like the other forms of periodization. So on this RPE scale, if you have, say, exercise, let's use the squat example again. Say we're doing 4 sets of 10 on squat, and we have a set RPE of 8. That would mean that for that 10th rep, you feel like you have 2 more reps left in the tank. Okay, so it's an RPE of 8 minus that maximal effort of 10 would equal 2. Okay, so 2 more reps. So a simpler example would say, if we've got that same rep scheme of 4 sets multiplied by 10 reps, and RPE 10 would mean that 10th rep, you literally could not do 1 more, and you're at maximal effort. So that's how we would utilize auto-regulation and the RPE scale. So the way we implemented linear periodization was through the main lifts, the big compound, heavy movements that I was completing throughout my week-by-week programs. So this included the squat, bench press, deadlift, overhead press, and maybe sort of deficit deadlifts and stiff legs, etc., or front squats. So sort of variations of those compound movements. Now, linear periodization, as we discussed before, is that progression within a mesocycle. So for my big lifts, me and my coach, we were actually varying those acute variables, so sets, reps, and weight, over time, week by week, and making sure we gradually increased or progressively overloaded through either increases in reps, sets, or kilograms lifted. Okay, so say for a deadlift, week 1 I'm doing 4 sets of 6 at 180 kilos. That would mean week 2 for that same session, say I do the same rep scheme, I would therefore increase to 182.5 kilograms. Okay, so this just ensures that we're keeping some form of basic linear progression and progressive overload throughout the training block. Okay, and this is very important for the maintenance of strength and therefore the maintenance of muscle. Okay, so now let's discuss how we implemented DUP, or daily undulating periodization. So, like the example I gave before with the squats, and how within that microcycle, those 2 squat sessions, or within that week, those 2 squat sessions would vary in terms of rep ranges and sets completed. That's exactly how we implemented it for those big compound movements. So I was squatting, deadlifting, and bench pressing, so those heavy sort of powerlifting movements, and also overhead pressing, approximately 2 times per week throughout the training block. Of course, that would change just because the end of the contest prep, my volume did decrease, so we had to back off on that frequency. But throughout the majority of the training program, I was actually had fairly high frequency for all those lifts. So with that high frequency, we utilized that daily undulating pattern and varying rep ranges for day 1 compared to day 2 of any specific lift. Okay, so the reasoning for this is simply that there's sufficient scientific literature to show that in undulating those microcycles, as well as linearly progressing week by week with those specific movements, that is a surefire way to maintain strength and therefore maintain muscle when you're in a caloric deficit, as well as increasing and maximizing strength gains and hypertrophy when in a lean bulking phase. Okay, so the third form of periodization that we implemented was, as we discussed before, auto-regulation. Now, this was used mainly for those accessory exercises, the isolation exercises that don't matter as much as those big, heavy compound movements. And it was just a way of tracking volume and making sure I wasn't doing too much over time. So that auto-regulation was great for making sure that I wasn't overdoing it in the gym and that I was staying well clear of failure on those lifts that aren't as important. So throughout the training program, those accessory exercises were usually around an RPE of 8. So this ensured that I was getting the required amount of stimulus for those isolation movements, but it also ensured that I wasn't overdoing it and wasting energy and sort of forcing excessive volume through stuff that you only need to stimulate in order to ensure muscle maintenance. Okay, so now that we've discussed how to implement all 3 forms of periodization, we want to discuss why we're actually doing this. So why did I linearly progress on all my lifts week by week? Why did I undulate rep ranges within those weekly training sessions? And why did I utilize that auto-regulation? Now this all comes down to the tracking of volume. Okay, so we define volume as sets multiplied by reps multiplied by weight. And this is the main driver of muscle maintenance during a cutting phase and muscle growth during a lean gaining phase. We also want to discuss the importance of intensification periods. So this could be also described as strength-based training periods. So say you have a couple of weeks of training where you're accumulating volume, you're linearly progressing on all those lifts for specific rep ranges. This should also be followed by increases in intensity, okay, or strength-based training. So in the long term, that strength maintenance is going to lead to the ability to maintain volume, because weight is a component in volume, sets multiplied by reps multiplied by weight, and this will therefore allow for the maintenance of muscle mass. Okay, so next we should discuss cardio. So the forms of cardio that I utilized throughout my prep was high intensity interval training and low intensity aerobic exercise. So high intensity interval training, I averaged about 2 times per week, and we didn't implement this until we really needed to, okay? So until fat loss started to plateau. And this occurred probably around 5 or 6 weeks out from my first comp. So in implementing high intensity cardio, the benefits of this form is the relation and the specificity it holds with weight training. Okay, so if you think about it, doing a sled push for 30 seconds combined with mountain climbers, combined with rope slams, is a bit more specific to weight training and lifting weights in the gym compared to walking on a treadmill for 20 minutes. Okay, so it's actually going to support that weight training that you're doing and your actual program that you have in place. So low intensity training was implemented closer to contest day. So the reasoning for this is simply because high intensity interval training is quite, well, as the name implies, it's quite an intense stimulus. Okay, so when calories start to get low and your optimal amount of volume for training starts to decline, those HIIT sessions become quite tough to recover from, and they actually start to impede weight training in the gym. Okay, so they start to wear you out more and more. So to combat this, we can get a similar calorie burn by simply stepping on a treadmill and going 200 calories within a session, okay, or however way you want to quantify that caloric expenditure. So this low intensity training allows us to recover a little bit better and probably takes a little bit less out of us in terms of physical exertion. So another thing I want to add in terms of cardio is quantifying caloric expenditure. So your cardio sessions should be fairly similar, and you should roughly know, on a treadmill you'd be able to quantify the calories because the machine actually tells you, but in terms of HIIT training that's a little bit more difficult. So therefore we want to keep it similar week by week. So we don't want to be doing a bunch of different stuff because we can't quantify that volume and we don't know how much weight loss that might produce. So if we do want to increase weight loss through cardio, we know if we have a set plan roughly how many calories that seems to expend, or how sort of energy expensive that usually is, and we can then quantify our prescription of cardio based on those figures. Okay guys, so that's the video. So that's a very brief summary, and we could have an hour-long video on it, honestly. But that is the summary of the training protocol and cardio protocol that I followed throughout my prep. If that is too much to consider and you're wanting to follow a program, there are many out there. I would suggest hiring a coach that knows exactly how to periodize properly and how to implement and prescribe training loads based on your training status. Having said that, if you're following a training protocol consistently and you're accounting for volume, then you're probably going to make progress and it's probably going to work. But what I want you to consider and take away from this video is not what works, but what is optimal. And through considering these forms of periodization, linear, daily undulating, and auto-regulation, and implementing all three, we can be as optimal as possible, and we can quantify and account for volume the best way possible.